What sources did Luke use? And just kind of bounce through some of the sources here and just go a little bit longer here. Okay, Luke was not present, we said, until the second missionary journey of the Apostle Paul. So for the first 15 chapters of Acts, Luke wasn't there. He wasn't there for the first 15 chapters. He was with Paul during the Caesarean imprisonment. And so there's going to be 2 years in which Luke is in Palestine. And my guess is that while he was at Palestine, he met with Mary, he went with various people and interviewed them in terms of writing the book of Luke and the book of Acts while Paul was in prison in Caesarea along the coast of Palestine. Travel diary, very likely that Luke, as he was traveling with Paul would tell him of the missionary journeys, and he heard the stories from Paul, and the stories probably told over and over again in many different ways and times, saying how people tell the same stories. If you've lived over, 30, 40 years, you realize you tell the same stories over and over again. They're never exactly the same, and so you do a little jazz, a little improvisation, depending on the context and how the story is told. But Luke then, possibly hearing the traveling diary, and some of it, he probably himself wrote a traveling diary because he was with Paul on the second missionary journey from Troas over to Philippi. And so as he's traveling with Paul, he probably may have kept a diary himself. On the third missionary journey, when Paul comes back to Philippi, he's again with him. And then you again get possibly this journey. Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7 is huge. Beautiful message from Stephen there in Acts chapter 7. And why is Acts chapter 7 this huge speech by Stephen? Very likely because Paul was there, and Paul, this is before Paul's conversion in chapter 9, but this is in chapter 7, Paul was approving of Stephen's death. And so it's very likely that Paul, having witnessed Stephen's sermon, remembered it and probably was going over in his mind over and over again the Stephen's great, wonderful sermon there. And so Luke very possibly pulled the sermon from Stephen from Paul. Peter's speeches. What's interesting is Peter's got these various speeches. I think there's about 9 speeches by Peter. Remember in the book of Matthew, we had all these great sermons by Jesus. Well, in the book of Acts, we get these sermons by Peter. What's really interesting, and one of our writers in the article that we read this year for New Testament literature class, there's a comparison between the book of Peter and the speeches of Peter in Luke. So there's a comparison between 1st and 2nd Peter and the book of Acts. And what you find out is that Luke apparently picks up these speeches word for word at some points. In other words, some of the special words that are used in the epistle of Peter also appear in the book of Acts. And these are rarer words. So it's not dictaphonic. I want to say it's word for word, that he's quoting the speech word for word, because mostly they're probably summaries. But the summaries do seem to pick up the dictation of the original speaker. I guess that's what I'm wanting to say. The original speaker has certain phraseologies that they use, and Luke seems to be careful enough that he actually picks them up. So when Peter speaks in the book of Acts, it reflects the diction and style of Peter himself. And if you compare 1 Peter 1:2 with Acts chapter 2, verse 23 in Peter and Pentecost, he uses this phrase, for the set purpose and foreknowledge. For set purpose and foreknowledge. That's exactly shared between those two. And so it just shows he's picking up silver or gold. Do you remember when he's going to heal, Peter and John are going to heal the cripple? They say, silver or gold have I none. Such as I have, get up and walk. Okay, that silver or gold combination is found also in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18. Now it's not stunning because this one would be weaker because silver or gold, a lot of people mention silver or gold. But it's very interesting that it occurs in both Peter's sermons and Peter's epistles. Here's one that's more complicated. Judge of the living and the dead. The judge of the living and the dead. That phrase is not found very much also in the New Testament, and yet it's in Acts chapter 10, verse 42 with Peter's sermon, and also found in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5. So we're wanting to say that there's these parallels between between the speeches that are recorded in the book of Acts and the epistles, which just shows us that Luke is being historically accurate. Now, nobody would say, when Peter gives a sermon, most of the sermons we've got, are 10 verses, 20 verses, or something like that. a long one would be 20 verses and things. You realize that just takes 1 or 2 minutes. So what we've got is synopsis. We've got kind of abstracts, summaries of what these things are. But apparently Luke, even in the summaries, picks up the diction of the person who gave it. Here's some more. Peter and Paul paralleled, okay? And here's an interesting parallel. Between the early chapters in the book of Acts, you've got Peter doing some things. In the later chapters, you've got Paul doing some things. So there's a shift from Peter to Paul. Always wondered what happened to Mary, but anyways, Peter, Paul, and you've got this comparison. Similar, by the way, some of you remember from Old Testament. Do you remember Moses and Joshua? And how Moses and Joshua were paralleled there? Moses splits water at the Red Sea. Joshua splits water at the crossing of the Jordan River. Moses holds up his spear and they win the battle. Joshua holds up his spear, his javelin, and they win the battle. Moses approaches an angel, and an angel approaches, and Joshua approaches an angel. Take off your sandals, you're on holy ground. Very similar between Moses and Joshua. There's a transition in leadership. So too here, there's a transition in leadership. Peter, the big apostle, the early church at Pentecost, the coming of the Holy Spirit, Peter, and then the switching to Paul later in chapter 13 and following in the book of Acts and stuff. So, but you can see, they both preach the resurrection, Peter and Paul. Peter in chapter 2, verse 22, Paul in Acts chapter 13, verse 26. They both heal a crippled person. Both Peter and Paul heal a crippled person. Acts chapter 3, verse 1 for Peter, and then Paul in chapter 14, verse 8. They both heal cripple. Both lay hands on people, and the Holy Spirit comes on them. Both lay hands on someone, and the Holy Spirit comes on them. I'm sorry for abbreviating HS for Holy Spirit. But Peter does this in chapter 8, verse 17. I believe it's with the Samaritans there. Paul does it in Acts chapter 19, verse 6. He lays his hands, and some special people receive the Holy Spirit there. We'll talk about that later. Special healings resulting in crowds of people. The Apostle Peter does special healing in chapter 5, verse 15, and then there's a crowd. Paul in chapter 19, verse 12, special healing, and then there's a crowd. In both cases, they're both in jail. Peter goes to jail, Paul goes to jail. They pray for Peter, Peter gets out of jail. Paul goes to jail, they're singing in the jail, and all of a sudden the angel, in both cases, Peter and Paul, Peter in chapter 12, verse 6 and following, Paul in chapter 16, verse 25, an angel comes and frees Peter from prison. An angel comes and frees Paul from prison. And so very similar, a parallel between these two guys. And actually it's interesting here, the emphasis of the book. There are 3 times the conversion of Paul is mentioned. The conversion of Paul is mentioned 3 times. The 3 stories of Cornelius' conversion. Cornelius is going to be our Gentile. Mostly was Judaism. Up until that point, the church was Jewish. And now it's going to switch and be Gentile. And it's going to open up for the Gentiles. The olive tree, as Dr. Wilson says, the olive tree is going to be grafted in now with this Gentile branch coming into the stock of the olive tree. And there's 3 conversions. The story of Cornelius' conversion is told 3 times. 3 times Paul is in prison, and he goes between the governors, and Paul gives these messages 3 times in front of Felix, Festus, and Agrippa in later chapters in the book of Acts, around chapter 24 and thereabouts. Felix, Festus, and Agrippa. 3 times he goes before this Roman governor and defends himself. So you see, there's this kind of rhythm in the book where these repetitions come up and things like that. Now, this one is where we'll end our discussion for this lecture. And I just want to go over this because some people say there's a contradiction between the book of Acts, Acts chapter 1:18, and Matthew chapter 27, verse 5. Okay, Acts chapter 1:18 versus Matthew chapter 27, verse 5 and following. Now, here's what happened to Judas. This is the question. And they say there's a contradiction between Acts and Matthew on what happened to Judas. So the Bible contradicts itself. Therefore, the Bible has got errors in it, and people go off like that all the time. Well, let's look at this. Now, as we said before, can different witnesses see the story differently? and different witnesses record the story differently. When you've got two referees in the same basketball game, can they see what happened differently? And one guy sees the foul, the other guy's looking at the same place, does not see the foul. Okay? So here's what we have in Acts chapter 1, verse 18. It says this: what happened to Judas? With the reward he got for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. Who bought a field? Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and his intestines spilled out, and everyone in Jerusalem heard about it. How did Judas die? Judas bought a field, he then fell down, and his body burst open, and his guts, intestines, okay, a little bit too much information here, fell out, okay? So that's how Judas died. Now, go back to Matthew. How does Matthew say Judas died? Okay? Matthew chapter 27, verse 5. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and he returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and elders. I have sinned, Judas said. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. So how did Judas die? Judas went away and he hanged himself. So that's how he died. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, it is against the law to put this into the treasury since it's blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Now, how do those two narratives differ? In the one, Judas buys the field, and then Judas falls headlong and his stomach bursts out. Okay? In the second story, Judas goes back to the high priest and stuff and chucks some 30 silver coins at them, and then he goes out, he hangs himself, and they take the money and they buy the field. So which one's right? They seem to contradict. Well, if any of you're creative individuals, you realize they're both true. They're just telling different stories. When it says that Judas bought the field, did he buy the field? Yes, it was his 30 coins that they used to go out and buy the field. So whether I go out and go to Sam's Club and I go up there and buy the stuff, or I give my Visa card or whatever to my son and he goes up to Sam's Club and buys some stuff, who's buying the stuff? Well, hey, it's on my card, man. I'm buying the stuff. Now, he is the one who actually did it, but it's still, I'm the one who bought the stuff. And so Judas, did Judas purchase the field? Yes, he did, okay? He did it through the intermediaries of the priests and stuff. Now, what about this? He hanged himself and killed himself, or his guts burst out when he fell. And most people realize, okay, so he probably hung himself, and that's how he killed himself. And then after he's kind of hanging himself, he falls down, and there was the rope. What happens? Birds peck the rope, or the rope breaks or something. And after he hangs himself, he then falls on the rocks, and his guts burst open, okay? And so basically you get this sequence of, hanging and then falling from the hanging and bursting his guts open, so that both can be true. So, and this is called harmonizing, and some people despise, they say, oh, you're just trying to make harmonizing and stuff. Yeah, the answer is yeah, because I trust the Bible. The Bible has given me hundreds and hundreds and thousands of data that are true data. So when I see one that there's a little bit of a difference here, I think you remember from a week or two ago when we talked about that woman who was hit by the bus. The woman was hit by the bus, she wasn't killed. And then the other story says, no, the woman was T-boned in a car, thrown out of the car, and killed instantly. And which story is true? Well, they were both true. Okay, the woman was first hit by the bus, and then in a ride to the hospital, the car was hit a second time, and she was thrown out and killed immediately. And so there was actually, both stories were right. And I think this is what you have here. In other words, it's just different perspectives. Acts telling us more the field focus, him bursting his guts, and basically Matthew putting it more in terms of the chief priests and the 30 shekels of silver and being hung in this field of blood being bought. So both stories are true, but they're complementary. They're not the same story. And that's what I love about the Bible. The scribes that copied this for thousands of years. They could have said, oh, this story is different from this story. Let's try to harmonize them. Let's change the text. They didn't change the text. They let the text stand with the conflicts, and the conflicts they let stand. And that just tells me more of the historicity of the Scriptures. The Scriptures weren't fudged on the way through by these scribes. No, they let stand these apparent contradictions and things, and you have to look deeper into the text. And that's what we're attempting to do. So let's take a break there, and when we get back, we'll look at Acts chapter 2, and we'll go into the book of Acts more specifically. Okay? Thank you. This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his New Testament History, Literature, and Theology course, lecture number 19, concluding the book of John and introducing the book of Acts.